You're
Right,
so modest.
indeed. I'm proposing today an evolutionary Christology, adoptionism and Jesus of Nazareth. Note here, I've chosen those terms intentionally so as to connote what I plan to speak of, Jesus of Nazareth, not another word, etc., and evolutionary Christology and so forth. Adoptionism, indeed, that's the title of the lecture today. In this next, however long we're together, you will find that I promote a very highly suggestive, dare I say, bold conclusion, one that is quite provocative and generally not in keeping with orthodoxy. Nevertheless, each part of this, which I will cover in the ensuing moments, is leading up to an argument that it is the Spirit which is, or who is, I guess, the imminent presence of the Godhead upon the earth. This Spirit also, the imminent Spirit, is also historically designated the sons of God through what I refer to as imbibification. I'm going to slaughter that, imbibification. I'll get back to an elaboration of that in a little while, but nevertheless, if I say it enough, maybe I can finally say it without stumbling. But regardless, this designation of the sons of God has historically been most pronounced in the one Jesus of Nazareth, culminating in his approval as the Son of God at his baptism. Right. I've coined the term, as I mentioned to you earlier, the imbibification, in order to refer to the process by which the Spirit once imbibed matter, or the natural world, with herself, and now continues to imbibe the world or matter with her very being, and that continually, by which the advancement of species was once made effective and is also effective today as well in an ongoing manner. By adding the suffix ation to the verb imbibe via another suffix phi, I'm effectively making this verbal phrase or verbal construction into a noun that has reference to an activity. And while suffixes often change the meaning of the term from its original sense, I intend this newly coined term of imbibification in its original sense of absorption or assimilation, etc. So then, the term imbibification is a word coined by me to refer to the descent of the Spirit into the Son, most proximately, at least in reference to what I'm talking about today, but it's broadly applicable to other things as well. But nevertheless, it refers to the descent of the Spirit into the Son, which causes the Spirit to be embedded within the Son and embodied within the Son as well. You can extrapolate that, of course, to the natural world, which I also do elsewhere. That is, that the Spirit's embedded and embodied in the natural world as well. In this capacity, the Spirit of God is ever before the Son, wooing him, luring him, and behooving him onward to his divine appointments. I will argue that via the kenosis of the Spirit into Jesus of Nazareth, the poor Palestinian peasant, Jesus of Nazareth, became the Son of God. I'm here building on my own work from previous eras, or errors, or other, maybe, and also building on the work of Thomas J. Ord as well. We've been both picturing kenosis as an infilling, as a self-offering, as a self-giving even, since or about the year 2008. So, understanding that I intend the term kenosis as a self-offering, I here apply that meaning to the adoption of the Son of God at his baptism. Indeed. I'm going to refer to this at various times in what follows as canonically donated love. Canonically donated love. Whereas I did not originate the terminology of love as self-donation. The great Karol Wojtyla did, or AKA Pope John Paul II, but he wrote that as Karol Wojtyla. Regardless, I'm going to co-opt it in its usage in this essay. Neither did I originate the terminology of self-giving, uncontrolling love. Tom Ward did. However, I will assert that this canonically donated self-giving love onsets an evolving fertility, which is most proximately, rather, a result of the panentheistic relationship between God and the world through the Spirit. This panentheistic relationship was initially wrought by the kenotic donation, self-offering, self-giving of God's very self through the Spirit into matter eons ago. What, 15.4, 15.6, something like that, billion years ago, right? And it's continually manifested itself in the growing complexity since that primal imbibifying of the world with the Spirit. Indeed, in noting that the creating Spirit gives canonically donated love, I mean to draw attention to the idea that she not only gives us love itself, but also her very self in the very act of love. Furthermore, in characterizing love as self-giving, I intend to once again draw attention to the fact that the creating Spirit gives of herself liberally to the creatures of creation and to creation itself. She, in fact, imparts part of herself to both it and them in a canonic manner. Hence, I say the creating Spirit's love is canonically donated. Moving on into a transition to Christology. Within early Christianity, there were at least 4 views regarding the divinity of Jesus, broadly schematized, I guess you could say, or schematicized, or however you said that word. That is, 1, that he was divine but not human, known as Docetism. Docetism. That he was human but not divine, known as the Ebionite position. Thirdly, that he was divine and human as 2 figures in one person, which was characterized by the Alexandrian and the Antiochian positions, respectively. And fourthly, that he was fully divine and fully human as one figure in one person. This latter option, the fourth one, won the day and became orthodoxy. But I stipulate that such a contention that God is both that Jesus is both fully God and fully man at one and the same time is absurd to speak of scientifically. Totally absurd. It's unthinkable, in fact, in a scientifically literate society like the 21st century context. The position described in the previous paragraphs above, that is, that the infilling of the Son by the Spirit, has historically been referred to as adoptionism, or even more precisely, dynamic monarchism. Through this self-giving love, which I spoke of earlier, and through the self-giving canonic act of canonic donation, the Spirit imparts to Jesus of Nazareth an empowered ministry to the lost and destitute of the earth. And he becomes also thereby the duly appointed Son of God, insomuch as the fullness of the deity is bestowed upon him through the process of imbibification. Although the term imbibification is my own, a noun used by me to refer to the process of imbibing, the sense in which I use it can be found in the notes of one Barter Ehrman. Ehrman brings forth evidence for Christianity changing its mind with the view called adoptionism, for example. He attributes this view, that is adoptionism, to the 2nd century Ebionites and the 3rd century Theodosians. Each of these groups is said to have believed that Jesus was a mere man who was adopted by God, the Father, if you will, at his baptism. In fact, Ehrman reports that in terms of their Christological views, quote, the Ebionites did not, or I should say, the Ebionites do indeed appear to have subscribed to the perspective of the first Christians. So Ehrman makes the case here, and I don't have my references in front of me because I'm just reading this paper, but nevertheless, everyone makes the case in this book that the Ebionites, a second century product, was actually, in their position of adoption, was actually closer to the first generation Christians than is commonly assumed, and I seem to agree with that. As such, it is my contention that the Son of God is definitively constituted by the primordial self-donating kenotic spirit, which also thereby means that the Son is pneumatologically derived. Pneumatology then becomes the central story of God's work upon the earth during the biblical era, through the Son of God, who is himself empowered by the Spirit, as well as in the contemporary era, wherein the Spirit has free reign. Now, I will note here quickly a cursory examination of the 2nd century CE. That was a particularly messy century. It was, by all accounts, a formative one, even a transitional one in the life of the church. A moment in time when she was vulnerable to what had often been deemed wrong-headed thinking. The doctrine of Christ was probably the most contentious of all doctrines debated in the 2nd century CE. That is, the desire to develop a coherent Christology. After all, these people were asking themselves, was Jesus of Nazareth divine insomuch as he was not therefore at all man? Or was he a man exalted to the position of God by a spotless life and death? Further, was he even a mix of God and man? These questions, at least indirectly, I plan to address in what follows. I make mention of Larry Hurtado. I'm not going to go into that for time's sake, but Larry Hurtado mentions 7 very strong postulates regarding a high Christology being evident early in the 2nd century movement of Christianity. I'm not going to go into them because you can read them on your own, but nevertheless, I don't think things are that clear cut. I mean, history is a lot more messy, I think, than what Hurtado gives credence to. So you can read through that and you can ask me questions about that if you want to, but I want to move on. Many divisive points were registered with reference to the aforementioned questions that of Hurtado of theology. Much of the presumed wrong-headed thinking historically has been referred to as heresy, which apparently was a word first coined by Bishop Ignatius in the latter part of the 1st century CE. However, here's a strong postulation on my part. There would be no heresy without orthodoxy, and conversely, there would be no orthodoxy without heresy. The two go hand in hand. In fact, that is the case that the heresies themselves, quote unquote, caused, spurred onward, and generated the formulation and the reformulation of Catholic, that is universal doctrine, in the first few centuries of the Christian experiment. But again, I ask you, do not the winners of history write it? Do not the winners of history write it? Of course they do. So is it not plausible then to aver that potentially potent views of various doctrines that were considered aberrant were errantly swept under the proverbial rug by the winners? I contend that one such doctrine that got swept under the proverbial rug by the winners is adoptionism. According to Harold Brown, many, if not most, of the first heretics were indeed heretical in every sense of the term, but it is less clear that any of them should be called Christians. However, with the rise of the dynamic monarchians, of whom adoptionism is a subset, we have the appearance of believers, quote unquote, who ascribe to different realities that could still feasibly be called Christian. These monarchians rejected, that's the adoptionists, they rejected the duality or even the plurality of gods taught by Marcionites and the various Gnostic groups. In their stead, they countered that Jesus was a man of the best and most noblest variety, and one who was especially adopted due to his unique fulfillment of God's goals for his life. But he was not uniquely God from birth. Instead, he was either adopted into the deity, that is adoptionism, meaning that there was a time when he was not, or he was progressively manifested to be the Son of God in a different mode or aspect, meaning, or that is modalism. Modalism simply asserts modalism and adoptionism are the two forms of dynamic monarchianism. Adoptionism indicates that Jesus was adopted as the Son of God, and of course, modalism indicates that the Son of God was merely the God the Father on earth, and then God the Spirit is merely God the Son now in this present dispensation. Does that make sense there? I hope it does. Let us try to understand why these positions, such as that which the monarchians held, were important in the 2nd century and are still relevant to us in the 21st. I'm going to make a contention here that I think is feasible, but maybe somewhat tenuous for people who know the movement better than I do. I'm going to argue that dynamic monarchism, both in its adoptionistic and its modalistic varieties, was a response to the arrival and the affirmation by several people, as well by many people, as well as the promulgation of Gnostic tendencies within the embryonic Christian movement, I should say. These multiple Gnostic groups claimed that there were at least two gods, if not more, divine beings, that is, a good God and an evil anti-God. The somewhat nascent Christian movement was divided. Would they take the considered orthodox position, or would they adopt and protect and perpetuate the Gnostic viewpoints? I propose that dynamic monarchians were a response to the fledgling Gnostic movement within the 2nd century CE. The response of the church to Gnosticism claimed that there was only one God, the Creator, who was holy and entirely good. But if there's only one God, what to do with Jesus of Nazareth? Of course, Orthodox answers abound, and often spurious or heretical views also abound, which I'm covering one today, adoptionism. Questions like this must have been at the forefront of the fledgling Christian movement. Who was Jesus? Was he God? Surely he was more than man, the early church must have thought, but was he God? If not, who and what was he? And if so, how do they still claim to be monotheistic believers? That is, how could they claim to believe in only one God if they affirmed that Jesus was also God? And if God is in heaven above and Jesus walked upon earth, how is he nevertheless God? As we know now, this was probably the chief reason that Jesus was put to death. Both his self-understanding as incarnate, as well as other people's understanding of him as God incarnate, to be the Son of God. Answering this question, the Orthodox route in the middle of the 2nd century began the formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity. That is, that the Godhead was comprised of Father, Son, and Spirit, and that these three are nevertheless one. This meant that God, the Son, became man. I'm using that there intentionally, became man. He pre-existed, but he became man in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. The Christian response to this quagmire, indeed, was to emphasize both the unity and the oneness of God in contrast to the inherently dualistic approach of the multiple Gnostic groups. But this response called into question the formulations of other doctrines concerning the God of Israel. What to do? It seemed that there was no way to maintain oneness while also affirming multiplicity. Into this situation, again, I assert, dynamic monarchianism appeared and was promulgated. That is, in its modalistic and its adoptionistic form. I'm going to highlight the adoptionistic viewpoint here because, frankly, that's the one that I find most persuasive intellectually and so forth. Epiphanius, I don't know how to say that, Epiphanius indicated in his writings in the middle of the 2nd century that adoptionism began in Rome with a man known as Theodotus the Tanner, who had originally renounced the notion that Jesus was the Son of God. However, he later began to proclaim that Jesus was Philos Anthropoi, that is, a mere man who received the Spirit of holiness from God in a special way at his baptism. According to Hippolytus of Rome, Theodosius taught that Jesus of Nazareth was a man born of a virgin, just as the council at Jerusalem stated, that he lived like other men all throughout his days on earth, but he was highly pious, and at his baptism in the Jordan River, the Christ came down upon him in the likeness of a dove, after which a voice thundered from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased," and so forth. Afterward, Jesus returned to the Jordan, whereupon he was led into the wilderness. Thus, after the descent of the Spirit upon him, Jesus was enabled to do mighty deeds, I assert, wonders, even dynamite or dynamis. But these wonders only manifested themselves after the Spirit's descent upon him, which constituted the moment of adoption of the Son of God by the Father. Interestingly, the early church writing known as the Shepherd of Hermas taught that Jesus of Nazareth was a virtuous man filled with the Spirit of God and thereafter adopted by the Father. While for some time the Shepherd of Hermas was indeed bound with the rest of Scripture, there came a point when it was eventually removed from the codices as bound Scripture, because I assert one may safely assume that it was due in part to its unorthodox Christology, that is, its congruence with adoptionistic Christology. Adoptionism holds that God is completely and totally one being, unitary, and above all else indivisible, and thus of one nature only. It seeks to avoid the problems latent within the doctrine of the Trinity, particularly with regard to Jesus not being co-eternal with the Father, positing instead that the Son, Jesus, was granted godhood by the Father as a reward due to his spotless and perfect life. While different versions of this position of adoptionism have held sway throughout history, for example, some that contend that Jesus was either adopted at his baptism, while others contend he was adopted at his resurrection, I contend the former, that is, at his baptism, is more theologically and pneumatologically robust, for it manifests a pneumatological constitution of the Son's deity. Note that the Spirit was seen to be descended upon Jesus of Nazareth as a dove, which is largely consonant, I contend, with the theological position known as Spirit Christology.
Are you finished?
No.
No, I got a couple more sentences.
What do you need to say something?
So then,
If you're still talking.
while Christians of the first 3 centuries largely agreed that Jesus was the Son of God, they disagreed over what this sonship meant and how it was brought about. For proto-Orthodox believers, it entailed a different level of existence from the rest of humankind. For them, Jesus was thoroughly divine. Other Christians, however, rejected this claim and argued that Jesus of Nazareth was flesh and blood, like I do. Indeed, I'm going to move on to my conclusion now. My conclusion: I have herein advocated that the idea that adoptionism is a potent and palatable option for the 21st century. I've abbreviated my presentation with respect to time and so forth, but nevertheless, I'll note here a tangential support, so to speak, of my, or at least an illustration of of the position that I would like to advocate. In so doing, I will make reference to Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, and so forth like that. After Julius Caesar's death in 27 CE or thereabout, a venomous power struggle occurred between his supporters and his own family, especially with respect to which one of his sons would succeed him as emperor. In the Roman world, it should be noted, an adopted child was given a greater, higher status than a child who was a child by birth. The natural son was who he was more or less because of chance, because of just chance events that he was born to a particular human, of two particular parents. The adopted son, on the other hand, was specially chosen, normally adopted as an adult, and he was adopted precisely because of his fine attributes and his fine character, which the natural born son would not necessarily have, as often is indicated by history. Most great leaders have terrible sons, so to speak, right? I mean, which makes the whole idea of a monarchy to be idiotic. But I mean, it goes back also to the Bush dynasty in America, but that's neither here nor there.
No politics.
No politics, right, right. Now, the adopted son, again, was normally adopted as an adult. He was made great because he had demonstrated the potential for greatness, not because of the circumstances of his birth. The case of Octavian being exalted to the emperor of Rome serves to demonstrate the truth of how an adopted son often had greater respect from his family than did the natural born son, and also how the adopted son within a family often inherited the position of his adopted father over and above the natural son, and even his all that entails, his position, his royalty, his accolades, and so forth, over and above the natural born son. Julius's truly eldest son, Caesarion, is merely a footnote to history, only really relevant in the reconstruction of bloodlines in the ancient world. Octavian, his adopted son, in contrast, arguably became the greatest Caesar in history, with his name forever etched in history as Caesar Augustus, the envy of the ancient world. He, not Julius's biological son, inherited the property, inherited the wealth, inherited the status, inherited the power, and inherited the influence that Julius Caesar once had when he was alive. I propose that just how Caesarion was adopted by Julius and thereafter became exalted higher than his brethren, who were more duly warranted to have that position, so too was Jesus of Nazareth adopted as son by God the Father. And that actually led to a heightened sense of his significance and honor in the early world, in the early Christian world, I should say. Indeed, that leads to a higher position for him today as well in relation to Father God than were he truly an offspring via the overshadowing of Mary just by the Spirit of God, as recounted in the Christian scriptures. By no means, however, was Jesus merely the adopted Son of God. He was the Son of God. Moreover, Jesus' adoptive father, was not merely a father, but he was and is the Father of all, God blessed forever. This is clearly an exaltation of Christology, not a demeaning one or devaluing one. The way I picture this, Jesus of Nazareth was exalted into his his Christological stance. It's not demeaning at all. If we were all but so lucky to be adopted as a child of God, but wait, according to the Apostle Paul, we all are adopted children of God. cross-reference Romans, I think, chapter 9, thereabout, and Galatians 3. Just like Jesus of Nazareth was made the Son of God by the imbibification of himself by the Spirit, so too are we made children of God today by the imbibification of the Spirit within us. Whose, again, we are made such, I claim, through the primary adopted Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, and the descent of his Spirit upon us, which will deitize us in the same manner in which it formerly deitized Jesus of Nazareth. I do not wish to merely deconstruct the doctrine of the Trinity, but rather proffer something in its stead. In light of this exaltation of Christology that I've offered heretofore, I would like to also further make several suggestions how we may approach the doctrine of the Trinity in the 21st century. So let me spell this out very, very quickly in 7 points, very quickly. First, and in danger of begging grace from all of my listeners, I declare that we must spell out the doctrine of the Trinity with utmost perspicuity, I should say. I'm going to stumble over that. Regardless, that is, we need to be lucid about what we affirm and what we disaffirm, offering clarity and not merely obfuscating matters more so. Clearly, based on how I've argued thus far in this talk, the direction I would like to go forward concerning the doctrine of God and the doctrine of the Son of God is something akin to the following. Second, the Spirit's descent upon the man, Jesus of Nazareth, constitutes his deity. Third, that Jesus is the Son of God need not connote that he participated in the divine essence, but only that he was taken up into the divine essence at a later period of time instead. Fourthly, thus, God's presence through his Spirit was bestowed upon Jesus at his baptism, and that presence remained upon Jesus of Nazareth for a long time, if not the remainder of his life. I say for a long time because, of course, the Spirit, and if you believe the biblical accounts, the Spirit left him on the cross, and he cries out, "My God, Eloi, 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 lama sabachthani." There we go. My Greek is a little rusty. I'm sorry. My God, why have thou forsaken me? Nevertheless, as the sixth constitutive point, although the Gospels refer to Jesus as the Son of God, Jesus himself refers to himself as the Son of Man. The underlying Aramaic of which by the way is what he spoke, Aramaic. The underlying Aramaic means son of a human. So then, finally, a seventh point, we need to go backwards in order to go forwards. That is, we need to go backwards to an earlier Christology that I claim was suppressed and subordinated to the more popular Christology that was deemed orthodox in the 2nd and 3rd century CE. If they got it right 2,000 years ago, why can't we get it right today? Indeed. In this essay or in this talk, I've argued that there are problems with the inherited doctrine of the Trinity, and it at least needs to be reconsidered, if not totally massaged, in the formulation that it currently exists. Indeed, I argue that Jesus becomes the Son of God by adoption through the divine power that descends upon him at his baptism, and he thereafter becomes an instrument of revelation and salvation for all those who believe upon him. That is, his fellow humanity who believe upon him. The details of my adoptionist proposal will be further fleshed out in subsequent articles and so forth. 1, 2, or 3, whatever, something like that, to be sure. I will note, however, that a processed pantheistic doctrine of the Trinity may be the way to go forward to alleviate some of these concerns with the inherited doctrine of the Trinity. Nevertheless, I strongly agree with the Anglican Keith Ward, I should say, who stipulates that there is a need to restate the doctrine of the Trinity in the 21st century context, direly so in our present circumstances. May we proceed forward then in attempting to reformulate the doctrine of God for our contemporary context. I know I will. I will, for example, continue to flesh out this adoptionistic Christology that I've spoken of heretofore. With that, I thank you for your time, and I open up this time now to any particular questions you might have.
And I want to say first, I'm sorry, just as Sergeant in Arms here,